Hi guys, welcome to CADS 3853 module number 12. This module we're going to continue our discussion about markdowns, especially expanding the discussion to the markdown cancellation and net markdown. In last module we talked about how to calculate the dollar markdown and markdown percent for an individual item. Okay, markdown percent being the difference between the previous retail and the lower retail price. And markdown percent equals the markdown dollar over the previous retail, so because markdown percent is percent of previous retail. And also we talked about how to calculate the gross markdown both in dollars and percentages. Basically, gross markdown means the total markdown for all items. So that basically means the gross markdown dollar is the sum of all the dollar markdown of all items, whether they were sold or not. And gross markdown percent is the gross markdown dollar over the gross previous retail. So that means the sum of previous retail dollar of all items. So the individual items markdown and markdown percent in that discussion just be extended to the gross dollar markdown and gross markdown percent straightly without really much changes, except that the markdown is for an individual item and gross markdown is for all items. Now, when we talked about gross markdown, I emphasized that you have to include all items, whether they were sold or not. Sometimes your items are marked down, but they're not actually getting sold, in spite of the markdowns. And so sometimes after the markdown period ends, you may have to remark it back up to its previous retail or original retail price. So when such things happen, then what's the calculation? That's the focus of today's discussion. When the price of unsold items at the end of a sale period is raised back to the original retail price, that's what we call markdown cancellation. So when we take a markdown, so to reduce the retail price, and at the end of the sale, it's still not sold, and some of the items might be sitting in the store still unsold, then we remark them back up to the original retail price. That practice is called markdown cancellation. If we want to calculate how much markdown cancellation occurred, then we will need to first know the dollar markdown for an individual item, okay, and then how many of the items remained unsold, so had to be canceled. Their markdowns had to be canceled. And there may be multiple groups of items like that, and we will have to calculate that for each group and combine them all together to know what the total markdown cancellation dollar was. So for just like the gross markdown calculation, again for markdown cancellation calculation, it's so important to first know the dollar markdown of each individual item. So when a bunch of items were included in the gross markdown, and then part of them had to be canceled markdown because they were not sold with the markdown, in that case, now the gross markdown and the net markdown become different, right? Because the net markdown is now the total of the sum of all the markdown of only the sold pieces, the sold items, okay? So gross markdown was, the concept of gross markdown was including all items, whether they were sold or not. And markdown cancellation include only those items that were unsold. Okay. Now net markdown includes only the markdown of only the items that were sold. Given this concept of gross markdown, markdown cancellation, and net markdown, we can easily imagine that the dollar net markdown, which is the total sum of total of the dollar markdown of all items that were sold, okay, that would be basically the gross markdown dollar minus markdown cancellation. Gross markdown, like I said before, gross markdown is markdown dollars of all items, whether they were sold or not, so including both sold items and unsold items. Whereas markdown cancellation is those dollar markdown, some of those dollar markdowns of all the items that were unsold. Okay, so if you subtract the unsold items from the sold plus unsold items, what's left is only the sold items, right? And so that's what net markdown dollar is. You can think about net markdown dollar in that way, so gross markdown minus markdown cancellation. Or, an easier way to think about it may be that dollar net markdown will be the sum of dollar markdown of each of all the sold items. Okay. Then we also like to calculate net markdown percent. The net markdown percent will be net markdown dollar divided by, okay, net sales. So here, the denominator, when we calculate the gross markdown, the denominator was the gross previous retail, right? The previous retail price. But now net markdown percent will be the percent of net sales, the actual retail price, okay, that the items were actually sold for. You remember when we talked about reductions percent in the context of markups, when we calculate, initial markup and maintain markup and things like that, the difference between initial markup and maintain markup was due to reductions, right? Those reductions percent was percent of net sales, okay? And markdowns are part of reductions because reductions include markdowns and sales discounts as well as shortages, stock shortages, right? So knowing all these things already, you should know that the net markdown percent is part of the reductions, which is percent of net sales, so that the discussion is extended here. Net markdown is always percent of net sales, and it's calculated by dividing net markdown dollar by net sales dollar. When we are faced with the problems that we deal with a lot of different markdown situations with a multiple group of merchandise, some are marked down, some are not marked down, some are marked down but not all of them were sold at the markdown price, so they have to be remarked back up. These kind of complex cases together, which is real life cases. In that case, it's very important for us to keep track of all the facts. And I kind of shared something, a spreadsheet that looks like this in last module when we did some calculation for the gross markdown. But when it comes to net markdown calculation, it becomes even more important. The setup that I recommend you to use is something like this. This way you will be able to keep all the information straight and not miss anything. So you kind of want to have the item group column and quantity available. That means the original number of units that were available, and then the quantity sold. So how many of the available items were actually sold, right? And those items that were sold, what were the original retail price and what's the actual sale price, which means if they were sold for the original retail price, then original retail price will be the same as the sale price. If the items had to be sold with a markdown, then the sale price will be the lower price with the markdown, so it will be lower than the original retail price. And what's absolutely the most important thing is the markdown dollar column, the dollar markdown column here. In any case, for any kind of markdown problems, that you have to first know the dollar markdown, right, for each individual item. So whether it's a gross markdown problem or markdown cancellation or net markdown, whichever it is, the dollar markdown is the key piece of information. If it wasn't given, you have to calculate that first. So that is the column that you must have. Obviously, dollar markdown is the difference between the previous and the lower retail price. So in this case, it will be the difference between the original retail price and the actual sale price. And finally, you can have the markdown percent column if the question is giving you this information, or you could calculate markdown percent based on what's given. Okay, so given the setup that I just shared with you, I hope that you will utilize something like that, a spreadsheet setup, to work on this problem. Okay, the first practice problem here. Banana Republic had 30 pieces of wool jackets in stock that will have to be temporarily marked down for promotion. Okay, out of the 30, 10 have originally retailed for $198 each, and 20 for $238 each. So out of the 30, we have actually two groups of jackets, right? 10 jackets that were originally $198, and the other 20 jackets were originally $238. So their original retail prices were not the same. Okay, the first group, which was originally $198, will be marked down to now $138.6. So that's the lower price, lower retail that after the markdown. The second group will be marked down by 40%. So the 40% is the markdown percent for the second group of jackets. Okay. So the first group, we were given the lower price, lower retail price, whereas for the second group, we were given the markdown percent. Okay. there are three questions we need to answer. Okay, the first question, what's the markdown percent for the first group? Okay, knowing the original retail as well as the lower price, retail price of the first group, then what we can calculate markdown percent, right? The second question is what's the new price, new retail price for jackets in the second group? So that means knowing the original retail price and markdown percent. So what is the lower price now with this given markdown, right? Third question, what are the gross markdown dollar and gross markdown percent for these jackets, 30 jackets, including the first group and second group when they are marked down with the according to given information. Okay, let's work on this problem. Let's pause the video here. Okay, so let's take a look at the answer together. As I suggested before, we're trying to utilize this type of spreadsheet or grid to plug in all the given numbers so we don't miss any of the information that we already have. Okay. In the problem, this Banana Republic had two groups of jackets that are considered for the markdowns. Jacket 1, Jacket 2. The first jacket had 10 units available, and the second group had 20 units. Now, the question didn't mention anything about how many of them were actually sold, so we're not going to have anything in the quantity sold column. Just leave them blank for now. And the original retail prices were given, so we just put them down here. And sale price is basically the price after the markdown. How much would that be? The first group, the problem gave the sale price as 138.6. For the second group, the sale price was not given. Okay, but what's given for the second group was the markdown percent. So the 40% markdown was what we know about the second group, right? So far we have plugged in all the numbers that were given in the problem. The first question was asking what was the markdown percent for the first group. So let's answer that question first. For us to be able to answer markdown percent, we first need to know the dollar markdown, because markdown percent is dollar markdown over previous retail, right? So dollar markdown is calculated based on the original retail price and the sale price, because it's the original retail is the previous retail and sale price is the lower retail, right? Take the difference between these two prices, and that came up to 59.4 as the dollar markdown, from which we can calculate markdown percent. So markdown percent is dollar markdown over previous retail, and dollar markdown is 59.4, and the previous retail, which is the original retail, that was 198, so that would be 30%. Okay, so that's how we calculate the markdown percent for the first group. Okay. And then the second question is asking what is the new lower price for the second group, right? From the second group, we know the original retail price and markdown percent, from which we can calculate the new lower retail price. Okay, according to the formula, it is the lower price, lower retail equals previous retail times 100% minus markdown percent. So that would be 238 times 100% minus 40% markdown, and it gave us 142.8 as the lower price of the second group. Some of you might have calculated markdown dollar first for the second group, so that would be 40% of the original retail price, so $238 times 40%, and then subtracted that dollar markdown from the original retail price, $238, to be able to calculate 142.8 for the lower retail price. Either way is fine. Either way, you are going to be able to calculate the lower price for the second group, which is 142.8. So here showing the dollar markdown for the second group, which it was calculated based on the difference between original retail and sale retail. Or you could have calculated this based on the markdown percent of 40% and the original retail of 238. So 40% times 238 would be the same 95.2. Okay, either way you can calculate dollar markdown. Okay, because like I said before, for us to be able to calculate the gross markdown, which is the next question we need to answer, well, first thing we need to know is the dollar markdown for each group of merchandise, right? So this was the key piece of information we have to calculate. So now that we know the dollar markdown for each group, okay, Then how do we calculate gross markdown dollar? Okay. Gross markdown is the sum of dollar markdown of all items, right? Okay. Given that gross dollar markdown will be, we need to know the gross dollar markdown of first group and second group, and we just sum them up, right? The first group, the dollar markdown for each individual piece was 59.4. We timed that by 10 units that are available, okay? And then the second group, the dollar markdown, we just calculate it to be 95.2, and you time that by 20 units that were available for the second group, okay? And then you add sum these two groups of merchandise, their gross markdown, that would be $2,498. That's the gross markdown for the combination of these two groups of merchandise. Now, to answer the last question, which is about gross markdown percent. Okay, gross markdown percent is gross markdown dollar over gross previous retail. So now we need to also calculate gross previous retail. Okay, so that is the sum of previous retail of all items. So we had 10 items from the first group. That previous retail or original retail was 198. So 198 times 10. From the second group, it was $238 original retail times 20 units. Okay, if you do this calculation, you will be able to get the gross previous retail. So overall, gross markdown percent was 37.06% given this calculation. But so far on this, the first practice problem, what we calculated was all the way through the gross markdown, which is what we learned from last module. But let's continue this case now. Let's say all of the first group merchandise, the jackets, the 10 jackets were sold. So all of them were sold during this promotion with the markdown that was specified in the previous slide. And then 15 of the second group. Originally there were 20 units from the second group of jackets, but out of them only 15 jackets were sold during the promotion, so during with the markdown. Okay, if the remaining unsold pieces were returned to their original retail price. Okay, so out of the 20, 15 were sold. What's left will be 5 units that were unsold. Their prices were back to their original retail price. If that's the case, then what is the dollar markdown cancellation? So how much markdown was canceled? Okay, and what are the net markdown dollar and net markdown percent? Okay, now we have to go back to the setup, the spreadsheet setup that we put together for the gross markdown problem. And then we fill out the quantity sold column now that we know how many items were actually sold from each group of merchandise. Then we will be able to figure out what will be the dollar markdown cancellation and what will be the net markdown, both in dollar and percent. Let's pause the video here and work on the problem. Alright, let's work on this problem together. So now we know that the quantity sold, okay, from the first group, all 10 units were sold. Okay, from the second group, only 15 out of the 20 available units were sold. Okay, so we can put the 10 and 15 in the column of quantity sold now. Okay, now then let's think about the markdown cancellation. How do we calculate markdown cancellation from here? Markdown cancellation is about the items that were unsold and remaining unsold in the store, right? Because from the first group, all items were sold. All 10 available items were sold. So only 0 items left unsold. So from the first group, the markdown cancellation dollar will be 0, right? 0 times the markdown dollar, which was 59.4, will be 0. So you can ignore the first group. From the second group, we had 20 items available, but out of those, 15 were sold. So what's left unsold would be the 5 items, right? 20 minus 15. So for the 5 items, each of the 5 items carried a markdown dollar of 95.2 according to the previous calculation. So those 5 items will constitute the dollar markdown cancellation, right? So the 5 times the dollar markdown of each of the 5, so that's 95.2. That would be our markdown cancellation here. So the next question was net markdown dollar. For us to calculate net markdown dollar, first thing we can think about net markdown is conceptually it's the sum of dollar markdown of all sold pieces, right? We had 10 pieces from the first group sold, so that would be 10 times their dollar markdown, which was 59.4, plus from the second group we sold 15 items, so 15 units times their dollar markdown, which was 95.2. We do the calculation, we have the 2022 as our net markdown, okay, which is an easy way to think about the net markdown dollar. But another way to think about net markdown is the net markdown being the difference between the gross markdown and markdown cancellation. Since we already had a markdown cancellation of $476 calculated above, if we can just calculate gross markdown, we can also find the difference. We already had the calculated gross markdown in the previous problem, which was 2,498. So we can utilize these two numbers that we already have, and by taking their differences, that difference we have the net markdown of 2022. It's the same because conceptually net markdown is the sum of dollar markdown of all sold pieces, and gross markdown is sum of the dollar markdown of all sold and unsold pieces, and markdown cancellation is the markdown dollar of only the unsold pieces. So you subtract unsold from sold plus unsold, what's left is sold pieces. So you can think about it in either way. You just do the summation of dollar markdown of all sold pieces to begin with. That will be your net markdown. Or if you happen to already have calculated gross markdown and markdown cancellation, then utilize these two numbers to calculate net markdown easily. Okay. My recommendation is to go for the first way to think about net markdown, which is just the sum of the dollar markdown of all sold pieces, kind of figuring out what are the sold items and what was the dollar markdown for each of these sold items. Think about it that way in most cases, except for the case you already have the gross markdown and markdown cancellation both calculated already in front of you. Okay, try to calculate them off just to when your goal is to calculate net markdown, sometimes can be even more cumbersome than just try to calculate net markdown directly from all sold pieces. So my recommendation is to go for just the summation of markdown dollar for all sold pieces, except for the case where you already have gross markdown and markdown cancellation already in front of you. Okay, finally, we also have to calculate net markdown percent, and net markdown percent is percent of net sales, right? We already have the net markdown dollar calculated, but now we need to calculate net sales. Then how do we calculate net sales? Net sales is nothing but the total, the sum of all the sale prices of every item that you sold, right? From the first group, we sold 10 items at the price of 138.6, which is the actual sale price, right? So 138.6 times 10 from the first group, that's their net sales. The second group, we've sold 15 items at the price of 142.8 with the sale price. So that would be the net sales of the second group, and you combine them together, that will be the total net sales from these two groups of items. Okay, so as a result, our net markdown percent was 57.31%. So how was that? Net markdown calculation can get a little bit complex, right? But it's definitely doable. Well, let's practice one more time with the second problem. Okay. Perry Ellis portfolio skirts 35 units were available at the original price of 165, and 20 were sold at this price. Okay, so original there were 35 units. The original retail price was 165. 20 were sold at the original retail price, okay, with no markdowns. And then the remaining skirts were marked down from 165 to $39. Okay. So out of the original 35 units, 20 were sold at the original price. So what's left would be 35 minus 20, that's 15 units, right? So those 15 remaining skirts were marked down from 165 to 39. Okay. So out of these 15 that were marked down, 12 were sold at this reduced price of $39. Okay. If the remaining skirts after the markdown period were remarked up to the original price, okay? So 15 items were marked down and 12 were sold. So what's left remaining unsold, okay? Those were 15 minus 12 is three skirts, right? those 3 skirts were remarked back up to the original retail price after the markdown period because they were not sold. Okay, so in this case, for those items that were markdown canceled, what is the dollar markdown cancellation? So how much markdown was canceled for those 3 items? And in this case, what are the net markdown dollar and net markdown percent? Okay, so far, given all the sold items. Okay. This question may seem more complex than the previous problem because some of the items were actually sold at the original price and then marked down, but not all of them were sold at the markdown price, so that some of them had to go back up to their original price. You know, there is a lot of dynamics going on in terms of this pricing of these skirts, right? But if you can get all the information that's given in the problem and plug that in the kind of spreadsheet that I shared before and kind of the setup, you know, the grid, then it may be a lot easier for you to get your mind straight about the what the question is asking and be able to answer the question without so much confusion. So let's try to draw a grid like like the one that we saw before, like with the item group column and quantity available, quantity sold, and original retail price and sale price, dollar markdown and markdown percent, and that kind of the columns, and see if you can plug in the given information in the right places. Okay, let's pause the video here and let's try to work out this problem. So I kind of put it this way. Although the entire group of items are 35 items, right? 35 units. Kind of we want to separate them out into 2 groups because some were sold at the original price and others were not, right? So the items that were sold at the original price originally started with 35 available units, but 20 items were sold at the original price. So originally 165 original retail price, but the sale price is also 165 because they were sold at the original retail price. So that was the first kind of group. The second group, so out of the 15 units that were left unsold from the original sale, the sales with the original price, out of them 12 were sold with the markdown. Okay, so now the sale price was at $39, although their original price was $165. Okay, so this is kind of the information that was given in the problem. From this, we can first calculate dollar markdown. We may not calculate markdown percent, but dollar markdown is key piece of information we definitely need to have, right? From the first line, original retail 165, sale price 165. That makes the dollar markdown to be 0. Okay. The second group, the difference between the original retail and sale price was 126. So that's the dollar markdown for the second group. So the first question was asking what's the dollar markdown cancellation. Okay, so we need to first know how many items were actually canceled, right? There were 15 items that were marked down and 12 were sold, so 3 items were left unsold, and for those 3 items markdowns got canceled, right? So that would be 3 items, 35 minus 20 minus 12, that basically represent those 3 items, right? Originally 35, 20 were sold at the original price, and then 12 was sold at the markdown price. So now what's left is 3 items. Those remaining 3 items each carried a markdown of $126 before the markdown cancellation, right? So that makes the markdown cancellation dollar to be $378. Now net markdown dollar will be the sum of the dollar markdown of all sold items. There were 12 items that were sold and each carried a $126 markdown. So you just timed 12 by $126. That was $1,512. Now net markdown percent is net markdown dollar divided by net sales. Net markdown dollar we already know, but net sales have to be calculated. We have sold 32 units all overall, and the first 20 units were sold at the regular price, so 165 times 20. 12 units were sold at the sale price of 39, so that would be 12 times 39. Combine them all together, that gives us the net sales from this group, entire merchandise group. So 1512, which is a net markdown, that divide by the net sales we just calculated, and that would be 40.13% net markdown. Alright, so it was a little bit complex, but we were able to solve the problem. So now let's think a little bit more conceptual things about markdowns. What are the advantages and disadvantages of markdowns? Obviously, the advantages side of the markdown will be increasing traffic of customers within our store, and which can lead to increased sales and the turnover of the merchandise. The merchandise kind of moves through the store quickly, and they're not sitting in the store. Okay. And by increasing sales, we may be increasing gross margin dollar, and which will lead to kind of a more easy cash flow, faster cash flow. Sometimes markdowns can help us clean up the stock, especially kind of slow selling items. We can clean them up faster if we take a markdown. And markdown allows us to free open to buy dollars. Open to buy is a term that we're going to discuss more detail later on in this semester. The open to buy is basically the dollar budget for us to use to purchase new merchandise. Okay. By taking a markdown, that reduces the retail value of the current merchandise, which can then be used, that much of reduction can be used to fill up new merchandise in the store. So that's what I mean by here, freeing open to buy dollars. Okay. Customers like markdowns, so another advantage of markdown will be increasing goodwill with customers. Customers will like to stop by the store more if you have markdowns. But markdowns don't come without cost. There are definitely disadvantages. That's why we are being very careful in taking markdowns. Number one, markdowns decrease gross margin percent. Markdowns may increase the sales, and which may increase gross margin dollar, but in relative to net sales, when you take a markdown, the gross margin percent reduces, because relative to net sales, the cost of goods sold percentage goes up and your margin goes down, right? Another disadvantage of markdown is that it can lower the store's image. If you keep taking markdowns, then the consumers are not going to associate your store with kind of a higher level of an image or prestigious image. In the same note, if markdowns are used inappropriately, too often, and without really impactful markdown percent, then the markdowns may train customers to wait for markdowns. So they will not be willing to buy any merchandise from your store at the regular prices, and they know that the markdowns are coming up, so they're going to continue to wait until the markdowns, the kind of percentage of markdowns that they are warning to actually happen before they can come and buy stuff. So that will be not a good thing for the retailer. Another disadvantage of markdown is that it increases selling expenses. Whenever you take a markdown, you have to put a signage that indicates to customers that there is a markdown, how many percent, and sometimes you have to change the price tags, and all those things are expenses, and those expenses add up to increase your operating expenses, which will reduce your profit, the bottom line. But of course, in spite of all the disadvantages of markdowns, we sometimes are faced in a situation where we have to take markdowns, right? Well, let's think about what are the causes of markdown. There can be different reasons why markdowns have to be taken. It could be merchandising errors, it could be operational errors. We'll take a look at them. Okay, in terms of the merchandising errors, there are different components of merchandising operations, activities that could go wrong that may cause the merchandise to not sell in time, so that you have to take markdowns. The first type of merchandising errors could be the buying error. You just bought the wrong style, size, colors. You just bought the wrong style that your customers don't like, and in the sizes that your customers' sizes are not, and the colors that are not in trend with your customers' taste, right? Sometimes it may be because you fail to test products in a market. Sometimes if you have multiple stores, and like a Walmart or Macy's, have thousands of stores, before they roll out the merchandise to every store, they may test, in a few stores, test stores, and see how they are received by the customers. And then if they are really well received, then they're gonna just roll it out to the entire chains, things like that. And sometimes you fail to do that, and when there are the products that are very risky, that you're not sure, but you just purchase them for the entire stores, without doing the appropriate kind of testing of the products and to figure out really the right demand for this type of products. That times when you might have purchased just too much, right? Another reason why sometimes buyers may purchase the wrong way is because they fail to watch the fashion curve. If you have already taken a fashion forecasting class, or if you're going to take it later, you will learn that the fashion curve, right? That basically it's a fashion life cycle, and a style becomes a fashion, and it goes down, and it's kind of like a curvy shape where there is an increased demand for a while, and then when it picked, okay, so but everybody and almost everybody has it, then after that it plummets, the demand plummets. When that happens, okay, if you don't read that clearly, right? So like last year, this style of pants were really selling well. So if you just base your buying decision on what happened last year, then you're gonna have to buy a lot of these pants, right? Because last year it sold well. You may sometimes do that, but it might have been that it was not like that style of pants was actually going up in the fashion curve, but it might have been in the peak part of the curve last year, so that this year the demand is just plummeting, right? In that case, the whole amount of the pants that you purchased will just remain unsold. I've had a case like that when I was working for a company as a buyer. So this is like something that you learn from the textbook, you learn from like fashion forecasting class and things like that, but you tend to forget until it actually happens to you and it hits you. So those kind of errors, obviously a lot of the items will be unsold and just remaining in the store. You will have to take markdowns to be able to get rid of them. Okay. Besides choosing the wrong products, okay, either because you just bought the wrong size color, or you failed to test products, or you failed to watch fashion curve, those are all the cases where you just bought the wrong products. Besides those kind of buying errors, there can be other buying errors as well. The poor timing of deliveries. You might have planned the delivery time, the shipment time in the wrong way, so that you have like a forecast, like toward the end of the winter. That would be a whole loss of sales opportunities, right? Things like that. Just your delivery, either they came in the wrong time, in spite that you ordered them to be coming in the right time, or that you just ordered them in the wrong time, for the wrong timing of the shipment, so that you got the merchandise in the wrong time for the full capacity, to be able to sell to the full capacity. In that case, you may have some items that are perfectly fine in terms of style, size, colors, but it's just the timing wise, it just didn't work out. Okay, and that way you have to take markdowns. Another buying error could be the failure to enforce the quality standards. So that you have your customers' expected quality from your merchandise based on the image that they have about your brand or your store, but you fail to enforce that standard in terms of the quality, so that your items are not meeting the customer's expectations in terms of the quality, then they're not going to be willing to buy them at the regular price, because they're just not meeting their standards, right? In that case, they may be sitting around at the store for a long time, and you may end up having to take markdowns. So all these things are considered as buyer's errors or buying errors. Another type of merchandising errors could be due to the pricing errors. Okay, so the styles are not a problem. It's the kind of styles that your target customers will appreciate. It could be like that, but you just put the wrong price. You overpriced it. As compared to what your target customers are willing to pay. Um, so that the items are just good, but they're just sitting around the store because they're just too expensive, right? Or you fail to check the competitor's price. If the competitors didn't have that item's price would have been fine. But then your competitors, like next door, had almost exactly the same kind of items at a whole lot lower price, for example. Then, even if the item price was not too expensive, right, it might have been an okay price if it were not for the competition, but then when the competition is going with a really low price, you might not be able to sell them at the regular price, right? So that you have to take markdowns. Another thing is the failure to understand customers' perception of value, right? What they consider as the valuable points, or what they consider as a good price for the merchandise. It kind of goes back to that wrong price thing that I mentioned in the first place. So the price that you put on this merchandise was just not meeting your customers' perception of the value of the merchandise and how much they would be willing to pay for that type of value of a merchandise item. Another thing that causes the wrong price is also called improper price lining. I explained what price lining is in an earlier module. Price lining is basically deciding on specific price points for a category of merchandise. So for an item class like T-shirt or dress, or for that particular item class, you decide on what the price points are going to be. So for all T-shirts, you're going to sell them for either like $9.99, $19.99, $29.99. Deciding on those price points. When you do decide on the wrong price points, not the kind of price points that your customers will be able to understand, okay? Either they are too high or too low, or something like that. If it's too low, then may sometimes give the customers the wrong impression about the quality, because there's some connection between the price and quality kind of association. People kind of associate high price with high quality, something like that. So sometimes people may get suspicious when your price is too low, okay? Or when your price is too high, of course, that's again the wrong pricing issue, right? Another pricing errors that could cause further markdown is poor markdown practices. Okay, you either mark down too early in the season so that it was not the time that people will actually purchase that item yet, or you mark down too late in the season with very small percentage of markdown so that it's not really impactful. Okay, if you're going to take the markdown later in the season, you have to take the high markdown so that it will be impactful. Okay, so that kind of poor markdown practices, sometimes you may take too frequent markdowns so that people are trained to just wait until later markdowns come, which will come with a higher markdowns, so that even though you took a markdown, it's not selling so well, so that you have to take more markdowns later in the season. And things like that. So all these decisions in terms of the pricing or price lining, or checking out the competitor prices, understanding what your customers think the value of the merchandise is, how much they are willing to pay, and what are the kinds of markdowns that you have been taking, and all those things can be causes of certain merchandise slow sales, and which leads to more markdowns. Besides merchandising errors, there could be some operational errors that cause markdowns. Like, for example, if there was an inadequate movement of merchandise from the receipt to sales floor, this can happen when you have frequent shipments and you got the shipments in and you don't open it and you distribute what present in the store, display in the store right away. Okay. Instead, you might have just kept it in the back side of the store, and just a storage area, and thinking that you're gonna present it sometime later, something like that, and just forgot to do it. So that perfectly fine style, color, size, and everything, the price, everything was fine, but they just didn't get the chance to be presented to the customers. did not display it in a timely manner, so that they just sat in around in the back storage for a long while, and that's why you had to take markdowns later, which is very sad case, but that happens really more than you think. Um, Another operational error could be related to the quality of the merchandise, but no inspection of merchandise. So, as soon as you receive the merchandise, you have to inspect the quality of the merchandise, whether there are any defects and things like that. And you forgot to do it, so you didn't know that the merchandise items had defects, but you noticed that this item gets brought in the fitting room multiple times, but it never got sold. So you checked it out later on, found that there was a big hole in one of the seam line, things like that. So so you found out the reason for the no sale after a long while of not knowing it. Okay, and later on you found that it was a defect, right? So that item obviously could not be sold at the regular price. You have to sell them at lower prices. Incorrect marking, basically you put the wrong price tag, although the price was actually higher, but you put the wrong price tag, so that the item got sold at the lower price than it actually should have been, right? So you didn't mean to take a markdown, but technically it sold with a markdown, right? A careless handling of merchandise in the store, which can lead to some kind of shop-worn merchandise, some kind of item problem, and so that the customers will not be willing to pay the regular price because there was some problem with the merchandise after many people touched the merchandise. In that case, that could also cause operational error that leads to markdowns. Couple of other reasons, operational reasons for markdowns also include poor visual presentation and high pressure selling. Okay. Poor visual presentation basically mean like the item was hidden behind some other items, so they never got to be actually exposed to the customers. Things like that. So when you do an in-store display, you have to take care in terms of how to present each merchandise item in the best way, right? So everything has to be accessible visually as well as tactilely to the customers. Also, you have to think about which items will go together really well so that it can increase the cross-selling opportunities, right? So put the coordinated items together in the same area so that the customers can get an idea about how to coordinate these items together in their wardrobe. If you don't do that, it may be a perfectly good item, but it was just sitting in the wrong area of the store, and people just could not find it attractive in that area because they couldn't imagine how to use it, right? Things like that. High pressure selling basically means maybe sales associate really pressured people to buy things, encourage people to buy things, and didn't give enough opportunity for them to think themselves, right? So that the customers bought these items. You sometimes probably have this kind of experience. You just bought them out of just being pressured, feeling like you have to buy something. So you bought them and you went home with these items. You felt like, okay, why I should have not bought this, right? So you regret it, and you would not just return it right away. A lot of times you don't have time to return it like the same day or something like that. So you may just let it sit in your house for a few days, and sometimes several weeks, and then come back and return it, right? So they will still take it back because you didn't wear it, right? In that kind of case, for the whole time the customer were holding on to this item in their house and without returning it, the items could have been sold to somebody else, right? So high pressure selling is not necessarily a good thing. It may increase gross sales, but it may eventually lead to a lot of customer returns, in which case that's not going to really increase net sales anyway, right? Not only that, that may actually increases the opportunities to really lose the sales, right? So increases the lost sales opportunities for the merchandise that was returned during the time that the item was held by the customers without being returned right away. So they can also cause markdowns if the items were returned later in the season. Then the items are not as attractive anymore, and they're going to have to be marked down. Of course, even if there was nothing wrong with the buying or operations or pricing and on any of those kind of aspects, sometimes we still need to take markdowns because there are some uncontrollable factors that affect sales and slow down the sales, so that we have to use markdowns to get rid of slow sellers. Like those uncontrollable factors may include like seasonal factors, kind of sudden changes in the weather, like, a very, very warm winter or very, very cold summer, something like that, that happens at, every once in a while in the climate. That can make a difference in terms of the sales, the very seasonal product sales, so that sometimes they lead to more leftover in the stores. Shop-worn merchandise, sometimes we cannot control that some of the merchandise will be shop-worn. Just a lot of people will try on these items, and some of those items may become in the state where that is just not possible to sell them at the regular price anymore, so that you have to take markdowns. There may be some sudden market shift in terms of the fashion changes, some fad comes around or disappears, or the economic crisis that makes consumers very stingy in spending their spendings, and those kind of things that sometimes, a lot of times we try to predict those things ahead of time, but sometimes those things happen without our expectations. In those cases, they may slow down sales of certain items or just overall sales, the entire merchandise. In either case, we will have to take markdowns to be able to get rid of some of those items. Let's talk about markdown timing. When would be the best time to take markdowns? You can take markdowns early in the season or wait until the late part of the season. Okay. If you do take markdowns early in the season, even if you take small markdowns, that may be effective, right? Because usually early in the season, not a lot of stores take markdowns, and so even you have like 10%, 20% markdowns, consumers may find it attractive because it's still early in the season. If they buy the items, then they may be able to use them and wear them throughout the season, and that makes more use of the items, so that makes it a little bit more valuable. So even if the price is still high with a small markdown, that may be still attractive kind of offering. Okay. Sometimes you take early markdowns to just clear out some of the slow sellers, so that you can free up the open to buy the dollar budget to purchase new merchandise, just to kind of change the mood of the store in the early part of the season. That may be why you may take an early markdowns. Early markdowns usually do not require a lot of selling expenses, because it's not a store-wide markdowns. Usually you have just a few specific styles that you will mark down, and you don't necessarily expect that it would generate a lot of traffic to the store. It usually attracts some customers who are already in the store to buy more, rather than try to attract a lot of people to the store just because of the markdown. So that may not require that you need to hire new additional sales associate to deal with the more traffics that may happen in the store, anything like that. So in terms of the selling expenses, later markdown with a high markdown percent will probably require higher selling expenses than the early markdowns, early kind of infrequent small markdowns on selected styles every once in a while. Early markdowns tend to disrupt regular sales a little bit more, right? So that would be the disadvantage of taking early markdowns. Early markdowns require lower markdowns, so you don't have to take a whole lot of markdowns. But again, if you take early markdowns, the markdowns in the early part of the season, that reduces the chance for the items to be sold at the regular price. So it actually may disrupt the regular sales a little bit. With markdowns that you have later in the season, you can try to make this sale, for end of season sale or markdowns, a meaningful event to really attract a lot of traffic to the store. Usually you would advertise it to maximize the effect. And having markdowns at the later part of the season doesn't disrupt the sales of the regular goods, right? The regular price. So that's it gives the chance to a longer trial period for merchandise to be sold at the regular price. So in that sense, the later markdown has some advantages. However, for later markdowns to be effective, you have to put high markdown percent, right? If it's a later part of the season, then consumers are not going to make long use of the merchandise during that season. They may have to use it like the next year or something like that. So for them to feel more attracted to this merchandise and want to buy them, you have to put a high markdown so that the price is really the benefit for the consumer. So as I hinted in the discussion of markdown timing, the timing and the amount of markdown that you take really are kind of intertwined together, and you have to consider a lot of different factors. First, you need to think about the nature of the merchandise, whether the merchandise is very fashion merchandise or basic merchandise. If it's a fashion merchandise and it seems like it's getting out of fashion pretty quickly. Fashion merchandise means the demand for the merchandise, that those items actually change depending on the trend changes. So they can be in fashion at one point, and then the next day may be out of fashion, right? So in those cases, you have to read the fashionability of the item carefully to determine whether they're gonna have more chance to be sold at the regular price, something like that. Whereas basic merchandise, those are the merchandise items that are not affected by whose sales are not affected by the change of the trends. So that means they can actually stay in the store for a longer time, right? Even if they don't sell today, they may still sell tomorrow, right? So you may not need to take markdowns on those items as often as the fashionable items, or really need to take a really big amount of markdown and things like that. So you have to think about the nature of the merchandise in terms of how much time they still have for them to be able to be sold at regular price, be still felt attractive to your target customers. And of course, you have to also think about the size of the selling space you have in the store, as well as the storage area. If you have a whole lot of merchandise filling up your space, both the selling space in the store as well as the back storage area, then that means that you really need to get rid of these items, right? So to have more space, you're going to have to take some more markdowns. And maybe you have to be more aggressive in deciding on the percent markdown, right? But if your selling space is still pretty good looking and you don't have a whole lot of merchandise sitting in the back storage area, there's no reason why you have to take a whole lot of markdown or urgent markdowns. Another thing is the open to buy status, the budget that you have for buying more merchandise. If you're short of open to buy, that means you are already overbought kind of situation. Then you need to take markdowns so that your current inventory value is reduced, and you can actually expedite the sales of the current inventory so that you can free up some of the open to buy, right? If you have a whole lot of open to buy dollar budget still left for you to spend, that means you're underbought situation. You don't have enough merchandise yet, so there's no reason why you have to take an urgent markdown or a high markdown. Well, inventory turnover rate is another factor to think about in deciding on markdown timing or amount. Inventory turnover refers to the rate of merchandise being moved through the store. So basically how quickly the merchandise is getting sold and getting moved out of the store. If you have a high turnover, that means your sales are going well and your merchandise is getting moved pretty quickly, right? In that case, you're not going to need to take an urgent markdown or a high markdown, right? But if your inventory turnover is very low and it seems to be that your merchandise is sitting in the store unsold for a long time and not moving fast enough out of the store, that's when you have to consider markdown and maybe high markdowns as well. And also the original markup or initial markup is something that you need to consider, especially when you decide on the amount of markdown. If you apply the high initial markup on a certain group of item, that gives you more leverage to take more markdowns, because you still will be able to maintain certain good percentage markdown, right? But if your initial markup was pretty low on certain group of items, for those group of items, you don't have a lot of room to take markdown because your initial markup was not high enough, right? If you take too much markdown, then you're not going to be able to maintain your markup so that you can have enough the gross margin, right? So the initial markup itself, how much markup you applied initially, okay, that is going to affect how much markdown, how much room you have for you to take more markdowns in the reduction in the price. Length of selling season and time left in it. Like I said before, if it's still early in the season, okay, you're not in a hurry to take markdowns and you don't have to take a lot of markdowns. A small markdown will still be effective, be attractive to customers. If you're late in the season and you still have a lot of merchandise sitting around in your store and back storage area, you are in trouble and you need to take more aggressive markdowns with high markdown percent and more impactful markdown advertisement and etc. As a form of pricing, markdowns play a critical role in profit. Okay? Because markdown affect net sales in both ways. Okay, markdowns can increase net sales if it can draw enough people, new customers in the store, right? That normally wouldn't be in the store if it were not for the markdown, right? But markdowns could also negatively affect net sales if the markdowns were not wisely done, so that it was not big enough to attract more people, it was not effective so that it actually reduces the retail price without actually attracting enhancing the number of customers you're going to actually have in the store actually buying the merchandise. In that case, your net sales can be actually negatively affected. So markdown decisions are very critical decision that has direct impact on the sales and profit, gross margin, all these things. So it is a good tool, an effective tool if used wisely. But if you don't use wisely, it can be detrimental as well. So we have to be very, very careful in utilizing markdown as our tactic. All right, this concludes module number 12, and also concludes markdown discussions that started from last module. In next modules, we are going to kind of go over some other pricing elements or factors that we need to consider in terms of pricing, besides the specific mathematical aspect of markdowns and markups. So we'll continue the pricing discussion in next module. Well, don't forget to work on module problem assignment number 12. All right, thanks for listening.